Scott, one of the questions that I've heard other people mention is whether there is a particular state, and I know you're from California and you might be prejudiced here, but you know, are there particular states, or is there a particular state that you think has sort of structured its laws and its you know, governance particularly well to address these kinds of issues that we might look at as a model? And I would say probably, secondly, are there any specific situations or, you know, local jurisdictions who have dealt with this in a way that you would say are good models to look at least to see how people have structured themselves or put together solutions?
Well, let me take the second one first. In the PowerPoint, I identified different districts, and I think that's probably the list of who I would tell you to look at for how people have structured and to find the structure that makes the most sense for you. In terms of states, I'm reluctant to say that I think California has legislated something well. And I guess maybe I should explain why California is in the position it's in, because California's role, kind of like Louisiana's, is it got to where it is for a different reason. In California, the Central Valley has about 1,600 miles of project levee. It was authorized through two main projects, the Sacramento River Flood Control Project and the San Joaquin River Flood Control Project. And there were 100 or more than 100 local O&M agencies. When Congress authorizes a project, the Corps needs to find a local sponsor, and the Corps says to the local sponsor, your job is to operate and maintain, and your job, and then we're going to inspect. And in the Central Valley, because it's 1,600 miles of levee over a 600-mile stretch of the valley, the Corps understandably said, we don't really want to have over 100 local sponsors. So the state took a state entity called the Reclamation Board, now the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and it said, you will be the non-federal sponsor, and then you will have corresponding agreements with all the locals. So we have an extra layer in the Central Valley. Well, when that happens, because the Corps is not liable for anything, wonderful work if you can get it, not being liable for anything, thank Congress for that, someone has to be liable, and under California state law, that fell to Reclamation Board, now the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. And in 1986, there was a big failure on the Feather River that resulted in about $100 million worth of damage and a lawsuit that with interest ended up being a $500 million lawsuit, which the state lost. And when the state has a $500 million judgment against it, it starts being really interested in these issues and wants to not be liable for the next $500 million. And this was largely a rural community with maybe 10,000 people and one little shopping mall, and you can maybe $1 billion worth of assets, and you compare that to downtown Sacramento with $70 billion worth of assets. So the state said, hang on, we got to get involved. And that's when the state said, we want a 200-year standard for urban areas. We're going to create grant programs. That's when the state really got involved. So California was motivated for different reasons. In Louisiana, after Katrina and the balkanization of all the local districts there, and the fact that you would have, this table is a levee, and you might have 3 levee districts having jurisdiction over different sections of it with no clarity about where jurisdiction went from one to the next. There was so much finger pointing that the state legislature said, we're going to combine districts and we're going to get rid of this balkanization and create some larger structure. And the state of Louisiana stepped in because of Katrina. So I'm actually really impressed that the state of Oregon is thinking about stepping in, because you haven't had a disaster and you haven't had a $500 million judgment against you. The state's recognizing there's some need here. So I guess I would tell you that those 2 states probably have more going on at the state level than any other state I'm aware of, but it's for slightly different reasons.
Great. Are there some other jurisdictions?
I'm Kurt Fritsch. I'm the city manager of Warrenton, Oregon. because the Corps in the room, I'll be really nice. No, actually, we work on about a half dozen issues with the Corps, and while we don't always agree, I always feel like the Corps is at least trying to move to a point of resolution. Having said that, the other federal partner, if you want to call them that in this process, is FEMA. And you made a couple nice comments when you walked through that, but probably in the interest of having at least one bad guy in the room. We don't get the type of cooperation from FEMA that we do from the Corps. They've actually, I think, been a roadblock in the process. They've been slow in getting their data together, mapping the mouth of the Columbia. The data is questionable. They do their own third-party review, and we know we're headed probably towards an appeal at some point in time ourselves, along with Astoria, the port, and Clatsop County. So at least we're starting to band together and work collaboratively, which they are not. And they haven't stuck to schedules and information that they've agreed to give to us. Do you have a magic bullet, either figuratively or literally, that you would offer how to connect with FEMA? Because we don't get the type of response out of the Seattle office that we really do with the folks in Portland at the Corps.
Yeah, regional differences are huge. We deal a lot with Region 9, which is out of Oakland for California. And Region 9 is a really responsive district that has been great with communication and great to work with. I think Steve mentioned in my resume that I'm working on FEMA appeals. And I have 2 clients in Washington State, 2 cities, and I'm representing them appealing a rate study that FEMA put out, just for the reason you said, because it doesn't seem like it's based on reality. There's been no chance at dialogue. We've identified for them that we don't think their mapping is correct. We think they've identified an event completely wrong, that they haven't looked at the most recent hydrology, and we hit a roadblock, and I filed an appeal. And it's on hold now for a bunch of reasons I can talk about later if you care. But when you're in that appeal process, unfortunately, it's really hard to have dialogue with the chain. Most entities don't have good dialogue when they're being sued. It's just the reality of it. And so I guess the advice I'd give you for now, before you file your appeal, is to develop some relationships outside of your region. And I was talking about this during lunch with some folks. There are some really forward-thinking, reasonable people in headquarters for FEMA. And whether they're folks that you go and visit or they come and visit you, trying to develop a relationship with those people, because they're the people who tell the local people what to do. And if you come at them with your local people are completely unreasonable and they're idiots and they're not listening, obviously they're going to be defensive and protect their local people. If you can come at them with, we have a common goal, which is to commonly assess risk and then to mitigate that risk, often the message is well received. So I've developed some nice relationships with folks back in DC. I tend to go back to DC 4 or 5 times a year on conglomerate trips for different clients and meet with them and update them. And those relationships have paid off, because when we're having an issue in the district or the region for FEMA, or when we need to maybe hold something off or we need to get some information, those relationships have paid. So if you're not getting it from the local region, I guess I'd encourage you to work your way up to headquarters, and maybe your coalition schedules a meeting and you go out and you brief them on big picture. And you don't start with everything they're doing wrong, which I'm not saying you would start with, but you start with what our common goals are. What do we both want to achieve? Here are our limited ability to achieve those things. We'd like to know how you would fit into that process. Thank you. Good luck.
Others? Reed.
Scott, a question about project level. I'm Reed Wagner, and I'm with Multnomah County Drainage District. And my question has to do with railroads and the fact that there's often a common area between railroads and levees. and whether you've experienced any positive solutions with railroads in other parts of the country. Our specific issue has to do with being able to test the levees, having an operating agreement with the railroads, and it's much more complex than one would like it to be. So if you've had any positive experiences, that'd be helpful.
I've had a fair number of experiences. I've had very few positive experiences. Where we have succeeded in dealing with railroads, it's because we found the right person in the organization that would work with us. And it doesn't happen a lot. But that is the only place we've succeeded. And we have tried getting members of Congress to make calls, and it has not tended to work very well. Where it succeeded, it was finding the right person. We could really use some federal legislation to help us with that issue. I'd be curious if our representatives from the Corps have any advice for us on that issue. No? Okay. Well, we have a new common enemy.